Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. I'd said I wasn't going to do another episode on Trump, or at least I wanted to take a break from it. This podcast is political philosophy writ large, and I think it should be a mixture of contemporary stuff, theory and history. So I thought it might be nice to take a bit of a break and have a think about Plato. Plato is one of my favourite thinkers in the canon, and yet I've never devoted a full episode to him. And yet, when I was doing the prep for this episode, I was emailing back and forth potential topics with my guest, Dr Carol Atack, and she said, we really need to at least have one part of the interview be about Plato's Tyrant and how people have talked about that in the present day. And I was like, you are so right. You are absolutely right. Because a number of people have made analogies between Plato's description of tyranny and what is happening in contemporary politics, and Plato's description of the man, the tyrant, and figures like Donald Trump. And to an extent, as you'll hear, I kind of buy those analogies, at least to an extent. What I hadn't considered is a really excellent point Carol made in this interview that really made me think about this differently, that it's not just that that Plato can shed light on our present age, it's that our present age sheds light on Plato, that in many ways the world we're living in, one dominated by figures like Elon Musk or Donald Trump, one in which seemingly stable consensuses are falling apart, one in which we appear to be living in a decline, a time of political and moral decline, in which the great imperial powers are seemingly faltering. For us living in that age, in many ways puts us in a much better position to see what Plato's going on about, to walk in his shoes a little, than people living 20 or 30 years ago, or in the 20th century even. It allows us to maybe think afresh about what it might have been like for him to practice philosophy at the very tail end of the Greek city-states, with a certain nuanced nostalgia for what was being lost, while also being quite clear-sighted that it was being lost. I hadn't thought about that before, but doing this interview and listening to it back, I thought, how right that is. We are now, in many ways, much better placed to not fully understand Plato. He's from such a different world to us. But perhaps move with him a little bit more than past generations have. So that's what this conversation's about. This is all things Plato and the Republic, with a particular focus on the figure of the tyrant. Looking both ways, what that text can tell us about us, and how our world perhaps sheds a little light into theirs. My guest today is, as I mentioned, Dr Carol Atack. She is Director of Studies in Classics and an Associate Tutor at Newham College, University of Cambridge, and she's the Associate Editor for Greek Political Thought for the journal Polis and the book series Bloomsbury Ancient Politics. Dr Atack works on 4th century BCE classical political thought, and this year she's published 2 books on key figures from the period, Xenophon and Plato Civic Life, which is obviously the topic of today's interview. As always, I'll just mention that if you like these podcasts, please do consider supporting me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, and a big thank you to the people who've recently signed up to do that, as well as my long-running supporters. Thank you so much. You are genuinely making the show possible. Okay, so this is Plato's Tyrant with Dr Carol Atack. Okay, I am joined today by Dr. Carol Atack. Carol, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Toby, for inviting me.
So we're going to do Plato today. Let's start at the absolute beginning. Who was Plato?
So, Plato was an Athenian who lived in the late 5th century BCE and into the 4th century BCE. We don't know exactly when he was born, probably in the 420s BCE, but that places his birth at a critical moment in Athenian history. So, he came from a fairly elite family in Athens. Both his parents, particularly his mother, were from very influential families, deeply involved in the city's democratic politics, and indeed in some of its less democratic moments, which I think is something we're going to be talking about. Plato was born during the early stage of a long conflict between Athens and Sparta, which we know as the Peloponnesian War. He was also born in the aftermath of a plague which had decimated the city's population, and grew up in a city that was in conflict and unsure at times of its where it was going, what was going to be happening. So his formative years were spent in a city that was often stumbling from crisis to crisis, with occasional moments of optimism and hope. And a turning point in his life was his encounter with another Athenian, an older man called Socrates, who we know from Plato's depiction of him in his later writings, engaged in conversation with the kind of young men who were being trained to take part in leadership positions in the democracy, and had them questioning their ideas and values. So, in his later life, Plato would turn back to this earlier period in his life and set many of his writings there, imagining his teacher Socrates in discussion about key moments. But what's really interesting is that often the values and questions that Plato is putting into discussion were live ones at the time Plato was writing. And he lived up till the probably just after around 350 BCE. So again, a period where Athens was somewhat in decline as a power among the Greek cities, still plenty of crises, also moments of opportunity, and Plato seized on some of those. For example, it became much easier to invite people to come and join him in this extraordinary venture. He established his academy, where thinkers from around the Greek world came to engage in conversation and study together. And again, that feeds into Plato's writings, which explore a lot of the issues that were discussed then. And some of those thinkers were important people in their own right. Others, like his student Aristotle, would go on to be important figures. In Aristotle's case, critiquing his teacher's thoughts and taking philosophy in a slightly different direction. So, Plato, a key figure in the development of philosophy, and also arguably in an educational tradition that has been influential right up to the present day.
Did he didn't live to see the Macedonian conquest, right? Like his Athens was that was in decline after losing its maritime empire in the Peloponnesian War, but he didn't quite get to see it extinguished as an independent state. That was Aristotle's time. Or
Yeah, so that happened a couple of decades later. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the writing was on the wall as we look across the history of Greece in the 4th century, increasingly see the rise of powerful leaders in city-states, whether they're transforming a state that was already powerful, like Epaminondas in Thebes, or whether they were transforming a regime of a different sort. So the Macedonians were clearly on the rise. That's clearly something that's visible. Other parts of the Greek world, the transition of Syracuse and Sicily, from which flip-flopped between types of regime quite often, did have a tyranny that arose under the leadership of a particular family. And the historical tradition associates Plato with that scene in Sicily. That's something I look at in my book.
So we're gonna do Republic, maybe some others, and particularly the Tyrant, which feels topical. We're not going to be able to cover all the context of everything that was going on in ancient Greece at the time. But let me ask the question this way. In thinking about the Republic and thinking specifically about the figure of the tyrant, what bits of that history that we've reviewed do you find particularly salient, or to perhaps put it differently, if you're teaching a student on this, what are the bits that you think this is the thing you really have to remember was happening when Plato was writing?
I think that context of what it means to live in a participatory democracy and the demands it places on the individual to take thoughtful decisions when they vote in the assembly or are a juror in a court. It's a much bigger commitment than a modern representative democracy places on voters. I mean, I think there's a duty to inform yourself about the issues and make an informed choice when you vote for a candidate or a party. In Athens, there weren't parties, it was all about individuals. So thinking about what it means to participate in politics is an important question. It's a question that Plato sometimes answered by feeling that fewer people should be making that decision, so that only the people with the leisure to develop the proper kind of mindset and level of information would be good people to be taking part in this process. So he's a critique of democracy in that respect. But I think it's an important debating point in Athens throughout. We see it in Thucydides' histories as well, that idea that a certain kind of knowledge is necessary to make a good contribution to politics.
Let me ask one really basic question. Plato's most famous work is Republic. Why? He has quite a lot of works. I mean, there's a couple of dozen of them, right? Why is this the one that, if you're going to learn about Plato, we start here? Has this always been the one he's known for, or is that a more recent thing?
It's actually a more recent thing, and it's a very interesting history. If you think about depictions of Plato and the way he was treated in the past, the most important text in his early reception history was his cosmogony, the Timaeus, where he imagines how a creator God creates a world out of, and how he orders everything in it. And that was hugely important in the later Platonist tradition. It also fed into other religious traditions. So there's a huge crossover between Plato's thought and the thinking of some branches of early Christianity. You see that importance, that idea of reason being an important part of everything. You see even in the Gospel. So the Gospel of St. John, which is often thought to have been written by somebody with Platonist tendencies. So that ancient reception is very much focused on cosmic thought, and that really persists even into the Renaissance and the rediscovery of ancient Greek literature. So if you go and see Raphael's fresco of the School of Athens in the Vatican, Aristotle is holding his Ethics. That's the most important work he wrote. Plato is holding the Timaeus, and Plato is pointing up to the sky, emphasizing the importance of that cosmic thought. And there are various reasons why the Republic wasn't that interesting. It wasn't that political context of democratic Athens wasn't that relevant through this historical period. It's the development of modern democracy sees a renewal of interest in Plato's political thought. But there's a huge wariness of Athenian democracy. They generally follow the Roman view that, it's a terrible rabble and we just shouldn't go that way. Let's try and be more like the Roman Republic with its very clear class system and limits to active political participation. And it's quite intriguing. One motor in the recovery of the Republic as a core text, it's very interesting to democratic reformers in the 19th century. So you see people like George Grote and John Stuart Mill are reading this kind of background. Grote, of course, hugely interested in democratic Athens. And it then forgets its kind of place, its cultural place in certainly English political thinking is cemented when Jowett puts it on the reformed syllabus of Oxford Greats as a set text, which students can spend a whole term studying, and it's stayed there ever since, and is an option has been studied, therefore, by vast numbers of people who've gone on to be politicians or philosophers. And
I did that. I didn't go on to become a politician, and I pretend to be a philosopher on the internet, but I did the Plato semester as a PP Ox degree. So anyway.
Yeah, so it's been hugely influential, I think, as a part of that. And I'm sure, I think it is a great text to spend a whole term doing a deep dive into. There's a lot there. Interestingly, and we might talk a bit more about this later, one of the reasons it was picked wasn't just the political content, but also because the city Plato imagines as part of the text gives women a role in running the society, and Jowett thought that was appropriate. It was the text which gave women the greatest role in society. So in a sense, it's a response to early feminist thought too, which of course was a key part of 19th century liberalism.
That's so interesting, and let's come back to that. Yeah, and as a complete aside, I've spent quite a bit of time recently on like the sort of composition and sourcing of the New Testament, so like who those authors read. I wouldn't have necessarily realized it at first, because it's not like they're going, and here I cite Plato. Yeah. But yeah, John certainly. I also think Paul had read. It's hard to say exactly which ones, but Paul knows Greek philosophy, I think, quite clearly.
Yeah, he goes. He's in contact. There are people reading Greek philosophy in all the intellectual centres around the Greek world, and Paul obviously is in contact with many of them as he travels. So it's not really surprising. And
no, and I think for the longest time we've kind of compartmentalized that world into like Jewish, or I guess anachronistically Judean influences, and then Greco-Roman on the other. But there was a huge overlap on both sides, and the New Testament draws from both. But that's another story and a whole
another story,
a whole other podcast. Going to the Republic then. Unlike some big blockbuster works of philosophy that just kind of launch in, Plato spends quite a bit of time, the whole first book of 10 really, setting up like what he thinks he's doing and like the so-called challenge of the Republic. What is the challenge of the Republic? What does he see him, and what does that tell us about what he saw himself doing in this work?
Yeah, I mean, it's book one is, I mean, people have in the past sometimes thought it was a separate work, but I think you're right to say it sets up and introduces the themes that then go on to be explored in much, much greater depth. And
It is quite different from the rest of it, though. You'd see why people would think that.
it's a different kind of conversation, and different people are participating in the conversation. So and I think it's really important in reading Plato to understand what's going on in those setup scenes, because they give you a lot of instruction about how to read the rest of the work, and clues as to what the issues under discussion are going to be. So it's not just even what's said, it's who's saying it, where it's being said, what are the circumstances under which people meet. And the circumstances are that Socrates has wandered down to the Piraeus, Athens harbour, to see the celebrations for the festival for Bendis, a goddess from Thrace, who Thracian immigrants to Athens have been allowed to set up a congregation and to hold a religious festival. So it's a multicultural setting, a multicultural theme. I think that ends up being somewhat important, but also the Piraeus, because it's the port city, it's where all the trade happens. It's a center of radical politics, and I think that's a tradition which has persisted to the day. It's like many port communities, it's very internationalized. There's a lot of diversity, but it's very staunchly in favor of Athenian democracy. And when he's Socrates is about to set off back to Athens, but is stopped by the children of Cephalus, an elderly man himself, an immigrant, but a wealthy one who's made a fortune, in fact, building shields for people to use in the Peloponnesian War. So the Republic takes place in the house of a wealthy arms manufacturer who is a foreigner in Athens. So you can see layers of complication being built into this discussion, which opens up on the question of what it means to be just. Cephalus is an old man. He's looking forward to death. He's very religiously observant, and that gives rise to Socrates asking him about what he sees justice to be. And he doesn't really come up with a good answer, nor does his son. So we get to whom he hands on the conversation. We get some views of what it means to be a just person that are very traditional, commonplace views in Athens. So it's a very, I mean, that use of commonplace views as a jumping off point is a very familiar method in ancient philosophy. We see it in Aristotle too. Assembled in Cephalus's house is a group of people that includes people like Lysias, who would go on to be a speech writer. It includes a visiting educator, Thrasymachus, who has a very different take on what justice is. So whereas you've had this view, very sort of religiously framed view, giving people what is owed, is that safe, is that not safe, giving the gods what's owed to them, then we have this radical view justice is just what's in the interest of the stronger. That's a view that was expressed by a kind of hawkish faction in Athens, the real kind of imperialist expansionists. Obviously, it is a view that did not end up going very well, and it's a view that Socrates resists very clearly. So the challenge is Socrates wants to say that it's in your interests to be just, regardless of what happens to you. And whereas Thrasymachus eventually goes away with his tail between his legs, and we might feel, as we often do when reading Plato's dialogues, that the interlocutors haven't put up the best resistance they could to Socrates' arguments, that Plato's sometimes taken a fairly easy way out in having them give in or realize that they've been trapped in an inconsistency, so what they first said can't possibly be the case. Whereas Thrasymachus effectively gave up, declined to pursue the argument further. Two other characters, Plato, who are in fact Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, insist that Socrates gives a better explanation as to why it's in the interest of a person to be just, and that opens up the much longer discussion that takes up the remaining 9 books of the Republic. And I think I'd say it's clear the importance of this discussion to Plato is marked by the fact that he makes his brothers the people raising this question. And that seems to be very significant to him, that the assemblage of characters in the Republic, many of them have already died. There's a kind of commemorative aspect. Obviously, Socrates had died traumatically after being prosecuted by the democracy, but Cephalus is already dead. One of his sons, Polemarchus, had been put to death during the Athenian tyranny. It's probable that Glaucon, the brother who emerges as an intellectual in the course of the discussion, it seems that he was already dead by the time Plato was writing.
So the challenge is, what is justice in a sense? And more specifically, is this anything other than, I guess what you could say, Victor's justice? Is this anything other than what the most powerful person says it is? I always get his name on Thrasymachus. Okay, I had 2 goes and both were wrong. Thrasymachus. So Thrasymachus represents that view. Plato has Socrates take him down, but the interlocutors still feel like there's something more to be said, that just because he's bested him in this sort of Socratic question and answer, they're still left feeling like we're not wholly convinced that it would always be worth being just, even if it led to bad outcomes for you. To which Plato, through Socrates, introduces the city soul analogy. What is this, and why is he making that move at this juncture?
That's a good question, and in fact, I'll be supervising students who've written essays for me on this question later today. And so Plato, part of the whole structure that is constructed through the Republic is because Socrates' primary claim is that it's in your own interest to be just, to have a just soul is just fundamentally better for you. You will have a better life if you are a just person. And eventually it emerges that he envisages justice as being a kind of psychic harmony of different urges within your soul. So he argues that there are kind of 3 divisions within the soul, 3 different kind of drives, perhaps we might say. there's the lowest level is an appetitive drive that directs you to seek material things, so food, sustenance, money, possessions, things like that. Then there's a kind of spirited drive, which makes you keen to do things, excited to vie with people for recognition in your community, gives you a bit of energy. And then hopefully hovering over them and staying firmly in charge is your reason, which enables you to calculate and make sensible decisions about what you should be doing. And ideally those should all be in balance. Obviously you actually do need to have some physical appetitive drives, otherwise you're going to forget to eat or look after maintain your body, and you need a bit of spirit to give you the impetus to actually do things. But what's really important is reason. And so a good person will have those drives in balance amongst themselves. What's possibly more problematic for modern readers is that Plato doesn't think that all people have the same capacity to have each of those drives. So in some people, one of those drives will naturally predominate, and they'll be driven to that kind of action as their kind of default state of being. And it's a hierarchical class structure which he maps onto something like the social structure of the cities he knows. So the lower class, the laborers, people who have to work for a living, become mapped onto the appetitive class, the lower class. The spirited people are people more like perhaps his brothers, more like some of the interlocutors in the Republic, the people who go and lead the fighting for the city when that's required. And on top of it, you need to have the thinking people. And this, of course, leads up to the big, complex claim that Plato makes once he's set up both his model of the soul and his model of the city. If the city, like the soul, is an object with multiple classes in which reason should take charge and ensure a harmonious balance, it can only do that if the people who know and understand and love reasoning are the people in charge. And thus that huge claim that philosophers should rule the city as kings.
So the ideal city is mirrored in the just man. Like, the just man is controlled by his reason. The just city is controlled by the reasoning class, the most educated or the most wise within the city. Here's a question. Do you and then there's a range of lower types of state and types of person. You've got the oligarchic man, the democratic man, so on and so forth. Do you read that analogy as being like one for one causally, i.e. saying a democratic state is filled up with people who have the democratic personality type, or every tyrant necessarily has the tyrant personality type? I don't. I think Plato's it's a bit looser than that. He's saying, here's some types of ways state exist, and here's some types of ways people can be. And notice that you can kind of make a metaphor between the two. It's not saying one necessarily always produces the other. And he does say at one point, not every person with a tyrannical soul is a tyrant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a one-for-one mapping. I mean, there are reasons for that. Partly that in a just city, not everybody, although the reasoning is going to predominate, not everybody's going to be doing that reasoning. So for some people, their access to reasoning comes through letting other people do the reasoning for them. I mean, that I think is something that is pretty hard to take from a modern perspective, but that does seem to be where Plato's thought ends. And in some cases, realization of the potential to develop either the good or bad aspects of your soul is going to be contingent on circumstances, and that's something Plato explores in the later sections of the Republic. Once he's established his ideal city, explained how it might work, and given some thought as to how you might produce the kind of philosophers who would be needed to keep it running smoothly.
How is this something Plato, his philosopher king's idea, is this something he's consistent on throughout his works? Because this isn't his only ideal city that he constructs. He also has the laws. I believe there's a few others. How stable is his idea of utopia across those?
There are parts that seem congruent and parts where he has had a bit of a rethink and a revision. It's very difficult in working with Plato's texts to establish a clear chronology of which work came first, which work came later. But in his political thinking, there does seem to be a kind of developmental trend. And as I think you said, there are points in the Republic where what Plato sets out seems sketchy. It is not a thorough blueprint. There are gaps where we just don't know from what Plato says in the Republic how he thought some issues would be handled. We don't know things about the living arrangements for the lower classes, for example. We don't know whether the eugenic breeding program is established for everybody in the city or is focused on the leadership, people in the leadership class. There's a lot that's quite unclear. But Plato does come back to the idea of how a city should be set up. A really interesting and underrated dialogue, partly because it is not as entertaining a read as the Republic is a dialogue called the Politikos, usually called the Statesman in English, where a figure Plato uses in some of his later dialogues, effectively a visiting professor from southern Italy, who's called the Eleatic stranger or the visitor from Elea. He espouses some philosophies of people that Plato had some contact with and both drew from and contested. He's also quite tedious and long-winded, which, as I say, makes the dialogue slightly less fun to read. But in that dialogue, Plato thinks in a way that's much more applied to the polis as it is, to cities like Athens, to how they might be run better, and to thinking about questions like the role of law within the city, as opposed to thinking about a state in which everything is just okay because cosmic justice is infused throughout it and everybody behaves themselves all the time. So in The Statesman, Plato does think a bit about political factionalism and about how you might weave together a city from people with different personality types and different views on things, and how it is the task of the politician to create a stable city from elements that might be fundamentally in conflict with each other, which I think is Plato having a go at trying to think about class conflict, which he is aware of in the Republic as a constant problem for all cities.
So you've got a similar sort of theme that he's tracking in both, which is the sort of harmonizing of different parts, but in different ways with different focuses and I think to some degree different solutions but he's
Yeah.
kind of got a framing of the problem
Yeah.
that has stayed throughout the works.
Yeah. And then in the laws, he goes on to envisage another imagined city, and here it's his character's project. And again, it's an interesting set of discussants. There is a visitor, an unnamed Athenian, who leads the discussion, and he's an old man. He's accompanied by an elderly Spartan and an elderly Cretan. And on a very long walk to the temple of Zeus, they have a discussion about how you might set up a good political regime that turns out to have a practical application, because the Cretan is tasked with doing something like that within Crete. It's a long, meandering discussion, of which a very large part consists of the suggested laws for the city and a set of texts known as preambles, which are speeches that encourage people to do what the law commands them to do rather than punish them for not doing it. So it's a kind of interesting take, but it loops all over the place, discusses all kinds of social problems. Atheism is, I think, the biggest concern. It's very conservative, very backward looking. Plato's very keen on Egypt as a stable ancient culture. He's concerned that there should be institutions that are resistant to innovation and change. It turns out he's got a big bee in his bonnet about new kinds of music. Clearly, he had not enjoyed in his own youth Euripides' introduction of a discordant kind of new music into his tragedies. And 40 odd years later, Plato is still grumbling about that in his writing. It's a very strange work. There's a lot in it. It's been deeply understudied, but I think people are really starting to look at it and appreciate what's going on in it now, and especially thinking about the restating that importance of religion in Plato's thought, that 19th century liberal enthusiasm for the Republic had somewhat put to one side.
Returning to the Republic, you mentioned women. What's up with that? Because in many ways it's easy to, and in some ways correct, to read Plato as a reactionary, as someone who doesn't like democracy and doesn't like poetry and doesn't like the music these kids are playing these days, like quite literally, right? And in the Republic we get this bit where, and the narrator seems to realise this is going to be a bit jarring for the audience, sort of suddenly makes a move, in addition to the slightly weird eugenics programme, says, and, if women have the same souls as men, they should do the same work, including being trained as warriors, including being trained as philosophers, and hence including being rulers, which seems quite out of context for a rigidly patriarchal society that we might expect a reactionary aristocrat like Plato to defend. So what's going on there?
Well, all kinds of things are going on there. Plato has very complicated views about women, and it would be a whole discussion to get to the top and bottom of them. Part of the issue is the aristocratic context is really important here. Plato lives in a homosocial world in which there is very little interaction with women. Women are presumably cooking and cleaning and cooking his dinner for him, making his clothes. But the idea of socializing with them, he's not very keen on. And there are moments in dialogues. There's one in the Protagoras, famously in the Symposium. The women entertainers are dismissed from the proceedings. There aren't any women participating in these conversations. There are no women directly participating in Plato's dialogues. There are imagined conversations with women, Diotima in the Symposium, Aspasia in the Menexenus, but they're effectively figments of Plato's imagination being voiced by Socrates. But where the eugenics is really important, and one of the analogies that Plato makes in setting up the discussion of eugenics in the Republic is with the breeding of hunting hounds. Glaucon, as a young aristocrat, is very familiar with this. And in breeding hounds, it seems that the knowledge of hound biology was such that the understanding is that the mother has to be a good hound, and female hounds were used in hunting. So there's an extent in which the role of women in the Republic is really based on the role of dogs in hunting, rather than any sort of realistic consideration of the missed opportunity to use the talents of women that Athens obviously and many other ancient societies failed to pick up on. Plato also seems to be echoing some thought of the comic playwright Aristophanes, who had envisaged women taking over the assembly and setting up a new regime, which has some things in common with Plato's Callipolis, in that there's a complete redistribution of wealth. It's a communist society in which property is communally owned. So there's a lot of discussion in the literature as to what Plato got from reading Aristophanes, why he's engaged with that. But nonetheless, whatever the reasons, he came up with the idea that women have to play a role in the production of the elite for his society, and can also hold elite roles themselves where they have the capability to do so. Plato does think that's a radical intervention. He thinks that the controversial proposals that he envisages for his imagined society, he imagines them as three great waves crashing down. So one is the communality of property, the other is the presence of women and the abolition of the family. So there is no traditional family structure for elite women to be hidden away in. And the third is the placing of philosophers in the position of power at the top of the tree.
So we've talked a bit about the ideal city. What's the non-ideal city, and hence the non-ideal man? Because on the one hand, you might say, at least by the standards of modern liberal democracy, even the ideal city, and particularly in something like the laws, feels quite authoritarian. It's not, you're not having mass political participation here or anything. And yet he sees that as the other end of the spectrum with true tyranny. So what is tyranny in Plato?
So tyranny is as bad as it gets. It's the worst form of regime you can have. And Plato here is acknowledging historical realities. Tyranny is an established regime type in the Greek city, and it simply means that one member or one family of a city's elite has grasped power completely for itself. And it was a common regime type throughout Greek history, and particularly in the kind of emergence of the major cities in the 7th and 6th centuries. So it's a historical and present regime type. But why it's so bad for Plato is that he has drawn on the psychology he constructed for thinking about how the ideal city should be put together, and the elevation of reason to power, tyranny is what you get when a person who is an extreme example of the prevalence of appetite in the soul takes power and has the resources not just to satisfy the urges for more money or more sex or whatever that occupy his waking thoughts, but is even able to bring about the longings of his subconscious, the dreams he has in his sleep. So it's as bad as it gets. And everything is about destroying community for the satisfaction of the desires of that individual tyrant.
And it's worth one thing I always remind myself of with the Republic, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree with this read, is we read it as a political text about this is what a good regime and this is what a bad regime looks like. But he brought up the political stuff as a metaphor for and a way of understanding our own psychologies and how we should be and how we should exist in the world. And the former is in service of the latter in some way. And the description of the tyrannical regime is both for its own sake, but also he's saying, this is kind of you, this is kind of what your head is like if you are unjust. Like, in the same way as the tyrannical city is a bad place, you are a bad person, both in terms of, like, your actions, but also what it is like to be you if you have this sort of equivalent psychology.
Yeah, I mean, he is very clear that it is not in your interests to have that approach to life, and he frequently alludes to how you will be punished in the afterlife for this kind of behavior. So it's very common for Plato to weave a kind of storytelling myth into his dialogues. There are lots of those in the Republic. It ends with a kind of memo from the underworld from a guy who has had a near-death experience, but been sent back to report on what happens to your soul after you've died. And Plato draws on various traditions to put that story together, but a key message is that you do not want to be on that field where you are given the choice of the soul for your next life as a tyrant, that you will be punished, you will have a horrible experience, and you will be punished in your next life. You will not come out of this well. I mean, in other dialogues, he's a bit more explicit about punishment in the underworld. In the myth of it's more a story of how ultimately there is a path to redemption through gradually being better in subsequent lives, but it's a very long one, and there is long-term punishment if you can't do that. It's a pretty grim picture, and it's a very interesting one because also you see people who've been powerful in one life choosing a quiet life for a future, like the idea that having a just and balanced quiet life is a better thing than having power and having a disturbed, complicated life. Plato's quite firm about that. But the tyrant not in a good place either in this life or the next.
What's so wrong with the tyrant in this life? Because I've always felt like book 10 is a bit of a cheat. Like the goal is to show that it's worse to be unjust. You shouldn't want to be unjust regardless of consequences. And then at the end he comes in and says, oh, and you'll be rewarded or punished in the next life. I feel like Plato's argument kind of wants to stand on book 9 an 8 of like, you actually just wouldn't want to be this person. Even if you have all the wealth or whatever, like, you would prefer to be a poor man with a good soul than a powerful or affluent man with a tyrant soul. Why? What's so bad about this?
Well, ultimately, you can never be happy. Because you will never have that sense of harmony and balance that produces happiness, eudaimonia. If you're trying to satisfy your appetites, they can't ever actually be satisfied. So you'll be reaching out for more and more extreme experience and still never achieving satisfaction.
Do you buy that? You like? Do you think there's a psychological insight there, or do you think Plato's grasping at straws with this metaphor?
I think there is an element of observation, looking at both the experience of expansionist cities, Athens in its imperialist phase, um, also looking at other regimes outside the Greek world, looking at, for example, the rulers of the Achaemenid Empire, which is always the kind of go-to instance for talking about tyranny. Um, so I think that, and this is not a realistic model of the Achaemenid Empire. This is it seen as it becomes a kind of metaphor for kind of regime overreach, and the view is that nobody being ruled by somebody with such an oppressive degree of wealth could ever experience any kind of freedom. I think it's notable that Plato's societies are, even in the laws which allows for private property, it's, if not exactly egalitarian, it envisages strict limits on wealth accumulation. And so that idea that when you have more unimaginable concentrations of wealth in the hands of a small number of individuals or one or two people, it's not going to be good for society. I think I can buy into that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure to what extent I'd buy into all of it. And I think Glaucon makes a good challenge in early on in Republic with the story of Gyges, who has an invisibility ring which lets him commit crime undetected. And how do we fit him into a model of justice?
Is it about? Could you make the analogy? Here's sort of how I would make it between the state that continues conquering and setting up an empire and accumulating wealth to its ultimate ruin, as the Athenians in his reading did, and then the Spartans almost immediately after do not do particularly well as an imperial power.
They did not.
And to say a figure today, like say an Elon Musk, who has more money than he could ever conceivably spend, and yet his desire seemingly is for more money. And Plato might look at that and say, but that's not healthy or natural or normal. Like, the point of having money is to enjoy things, certainly, to have a house, to have nice food, to be able to have your books and your philosophy, whatever it is that fills you up and makes you whole. But you've got it now, and yet all your thoughts turn on getting more. There's something odd and self-destructive about that. And however much money that person might have, you wouldn't want to be that person. Am I maybe reading a slightly too much modern into that? That's sort of what I see Plato as saying there.
Yeah, I think Plato, he's very clear that the desire for money and financial wealth is a very problematic form of appetite. I mean, it's a very bad appetite to be indulging. And he actually, he does remove private property. So his philosophers don't. I mean, they're given enough. They're living on effectively grant. They're subsidised by the populace in return for their ruling. They're not generating income themselves, so they're kind of removed from this process. There's a kind of separation there. They become a kind of public sector, and it's quite difficult to map ancient thought onto modern, because there isn't in the ancient, in classical, the polis isn't really a fully fledged nation state. So it's all about individuals and their actions. So it's that sense of individuals being in conflict with a state bureaucracy, with a kind of state machine, isn't something that really exists for them.
I'll tell you the other bit of the analogy I find psychologically plausible, and you can tell me if you agree, disagree, build off it. Is there's a notion of tyrannical states as kind of like eating themselves, as like there's a metaphor. He says they're like a reverse doctor. A doctor cuts the sort of tumour out. A tyrant cuts the good bits out of the state. Anything that, and you very much, you could do all sorts of contemporary examples of this. The bits of the state that might stand up to the tyrant's rule, well, they have to go. But in doing that, and you can see this with various attacks on American civil society that we're seeing right now, in doing that, you tend to get rid of the useful bits that are necessary for the state doing well. That seems true enough as a description of authoritarian regimes then and now. And I think Plato's trying to say like tyrannical people are a bit like that. That like a sense of reason that might say, don't just do what you think you need to do to acquire more power, or even like the thing that says don't have a second buttered scone, that is good. You don't want to strip that out of yourself. And just as the tyrannical state will kind of eat itself, the tyrannical person will kind of eat itself, in that anything that's ordering or rational or even concerned with reputation and like not looking like a dick in the eyes of others, that all just has to go.
Yeah.
That feels, it's a stretch. The whole analogy is a stretch, but I feel like there's maybe something to that bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually you can see, I mean, and for Plato that is very starkly realized by for him, that's what the democracy did to Socrates. And so there's also a tradition in Greek thought of thinking of democracy as a kind of tyranny, because it's the class with the appetites taking charge. So it's that kind of inversion you were talking about. And clearly it is not good for a society if it can't stand having that kind of reasoned critic within itself. So yeah, from that point of view, I think that it does hold up. And where we see authoritarian regimes suppressing criticism, I think that that's something that Plato would have recognized and would say, yes, that is an instance of the correct balance in the city, the presence of the justice that is the balance between the different drives being absent, being damaged, and the possibility going away with much worse outcomes than the consumption of a single buttered scone.
Exactly. I that's my go-to for a lot of things, because I like buttered scones. So that one has resonance.
Oh, don't eat too many of them.
What do you? Well, yes. Thank you, Plato. But what do you make of modern applications of this? Because for the longest time, certainly when I studied this text, people sort of said, yeah, this kind of doesn't seem to really hold up in the modern world. Like, it seems like what Plato has in mind here is a Caligula or a Nero, whereas our tyrants in the 20th century, your Stalins and whatever, seem to be much more businesslike. They're very terrible morally, but they're not this sort of extravagant, impulsive human being that Plato's seeming to imagine. And I think the answer to that is Plato is not saying every tyrant has a tyrant soul or every person with a tyrant soul is a tyrant. He's just saying there's an analogy between a regime type and a certain type of psychological profile, and fine. But then in 2016, when Donald Trump comes around as a political force, a whole bunch of people, you sent me an article on this, and a whole bunch of people writing in the popular space have done the same thing. They've snapped their fingers and gone, this is it. This is what Plato was on about with the tyrant's soul thing. What do you make of contemporary analogies? Does that track for you?
Well, I think it's something that has interestingly changed. I mean, one of the big critiques of Plato's project in the 20th century was Karl Popper's critique in The Open Society and Its Enemies, where he saw Plato's Callipolis itself as the blueprint for a regime like the kind of regime we saw emerging under, and probably a bit later than that, under Stalin. So that idea of an oppressive bureaucratic regime. Whereas what I think we have seen with the emergence of some of the incredibly powerful autocratic leaders in various societies, charismatic perhaps to some followers, leaders, where their appetite and consumption is kind of part of their persona. I do think it starts looking like at least a recognizable figure to track, and that question of what happens when somebody with untrammeled appetites gets access to unconstrained power becomes a very interested one. Of course, one of the key elements in the American example is that idea of a balance not between parts of the soul, but between different branches of the regime, between the different parts of the government, and that balance serves an important function. And we're seeing that under some kind of pressure at the moment. So I think it is an interesting parallel. I think that, I mean, it is certainly not very flattering to any authoritarian leader to be compared with Plato's tyrant, who devolves into a kind of personal anarchy that disregards all kinds of norms of accepted behavior. But again, I think in the figure of Donald Trump, there are some parallels that can be seen, that have been documented. So I think that was not a big reach for people making that point. How things play out now may be different, but I think at that moment in 2016, it was a useful observation to make, perhaps because it just reoriented how we were reading the Republic and thinking about it, that we had that switch from worrying about a bureaucratic oppressive regime to worrying about autocratic leaders who were intent on dismantling existing regimes, pursuing a very idiosyncratic agenda that seemed very much involved with the pursuit of personal projects or interests. So, and I think there are several examples of that. Not going to pin it on one person, but I think that's the kind of interesting change that is noteworthy.
I think so. I've sort of bought that analogy in modern times. I think it does sort of hold for Trump. I think both in terms of like what this project seems to be doing to the state. I think you can quite clearly see this sort of like eating itself quality that Plato seems so concerned about in the political sense. I also do think, and I think you can overstate this, and Plato is not a modern psychologist, and I'm sure people who are would have a whole lot they'd want to add to him. But I do sort of see that eating yourself psychologically quality in him. I see it very much in Musk, maybe more than Trump. There's a lovely bit in The Republic where he says the tyrant only ever knows master and servant. He never knows friendship. He's always flattering or being flattered. And like, never mind how bad that is morally, there's something very abject and pitiable about someone whose existence is that. And that does seem to me to be Trump. It seems very much Musk. I think Musk is always either completely deferential to a more powerful figure like Trump, or when he's the more powerful one, just a straight bully. You get the sense he's a man who has never really had friends, and like whatever else you might want to say about that man, you wouldn't want to be them. That seems quite real to me. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it is absolutely a trope of ancient political thought that the tyrant is a very isolated person and that he is going to struggle, that he can't have friends. I mean, Aristotle regards that there needs to be some kind of point of contact, some kind of way in which you're commensurable with somebody before you can be friends. Before you can have, and by friendship in the ancient world, they sort of mean trusted relationships of the kind citizens might have with each other. That becomes impossible under conditions of extreme equality. I mean, it's actually another thinker, Xenophon, explores this, a famous short dialogue called The Hero, where he imagines the poet Simonides in conversation with the Syracusan tyrant Hieron, discussing, Hieron's absolutely miserable. He thinks that he has actually less freedom than any of the citizens he's oppressing, because he can't just walk down the street. It's not safe for him to do so. He relies on foreign bodyguards to protect him. He can't have a relationship because he can never trust that somebody wants him for himself. They're not just sleeping with him because he's the tyrant and they don't have a choice. So there is a point in which it becomes impossible for a tyrant to achieve personal fulfillment. They can never experience happiness unless they stop being a tyrant. And I think Xenophon's thought is congruent with Plato's here, but he kind of writes up a case study a little bit more helpfully.
So that seems valid to me, though. Like that seems like you don't want to put too much weight on that insight, but there is something true to that, like how diminishing it is of you as a person to not stand in relations of at least proximate equality.
Yeah, it turns all your relationships into purely transactional ones. And that, and for Plato, that obviously marks them down as being associated with the lowest part of your soul. And I mean, for Aristotle too, the best kind of friendship are those between the people who are doing the best kind of thinking and can have a kind of friendship that recognizes each other's excellence, and in that recognition spurs each to be more excellent. A tyrant can't have that. They're always trapped in a vicious spiral. The only way is down.
I think let's close with this. There's kind of a final sense in which I find Plato's Republic quite contemporary in some senses, which is there's a wrestling the whole way through. And I'm not going to infer what Plato thought, but certainly he has characters' voice uncomfortability with this central dilemma of like we want to see the bad guy get their comeuppance, and the world does not seem to be ordered that way. Right? Plato's clearly like wrestling with that the whole time. And even though he provides an answer, he has, as you say, in Glaucon's sort of edition of this guy with the invisibility ring and so on, and the challenges, in some sense, he's not quite sold on his own answer. And I think we very much have that today in a world that also has political authoritarianism, that also has extreme disparity between rich and poor. An example I might give is there's been a number of docudramas made about the Sackler family, these people who achieved huge wealth in America by selling legalized opioids that killed a lot of people. And there's a sort of, and never were held to any sort of legal repercussion for that. And there's a sort of feeling that we, at the end of all of them, it shows how miserable they were. And that just might not be the case. They might have done these awful things and lived very happy lives, you know? But we want them. We want to see a poetic justice at the end. And I think Plato's sort of wrestling with that. And I think there's something true in this thing of like the isolatingness of power and the isolatingness of like dyadic power relations, the isolatingness of a lack of equality. I think there is something there that's psychologically true, but it doesn't fully answer the thing that we want to see the bad guy get their just desserts. And there's kind of just a complex ambiguity there that, on the one hand, yeah, actually you wouldn't want to be a tyrant. On the other, the world is not perfectly justly ordered, and we kind of just have to live with that ambiguity. I think that all just feels quite contemporary to me, or maybe it's just something that all societies have wrestled with in their own way.
Well, I think that for Plato, he's very clear that he's living in an imperfect society. I think one of the things that's most enjoyable about engaging with the dialogues is that there is always that openness, that indeterminacy, that you can take part in that conversation too and read the discussion and say, well, I wouldn't have said that. Well, what would happen? What are the consequences for the argument of my answer? Where can we take this? This doesn't work in my world. This is my option. So I think Plato, in that sense, the kind of dialogic nature of his work invites us to participate in it. And I think that's a really important lesson to take from his work. These are not treatises that are telling you what to think. There's a sense in which reading the dialogues is instructing you to take part in the process that Plato envisages happening, of going down that route of self-questioning that Socrates insisted upon the importance of, and really thinking about how your society works, what your place is in it, what you can do to make life better for yourself, what you can do to make things work better for your community. So, I mean, in that sense, I mean, and there is a big school particularly in America, as reading Plato as a democratic thinker rather than a stern opponent of democracy. In that very broad sense, I think he is inviting us to think about how we live, what we should be doing, how we can live our political lives better.
Let's end it there. That's a nice thought to close on. Anything final that I mean, there's always more to say with these sorts of conversations. Anything final you'd like to add, and anything final you'd like to add? Any particular pieces that you might recommend to the audience as ways into this? And finally, anywhere they should follow you. I believe you're on Blue Sky. Anything else like that?
I mean, I think there is nothing better than actually reading the dialogues yourself, but they are quite intimidating at points.
By the standards of ancient philosophy, though,
yeah,
by the standards of ancient philosophy, Plato's quite accessible.
Pretty
Republic
accessible.
is, certainly.
I think I'm actually, if you don't mind, I am going to blow the trumpet for my own little life
Please.
of Plato, which has just come out, because in that I try and show how Plato is living in a world and living in a community and responding to it, and how his ideas emerge from that world, and why some of the arguments he makes, you can see where they're coming from if you understand a bit more about the world he lived in. So I think that from a point of view of getting some understanding of Plato, that would be a good point to start. I think I would say the best commentator on Plato at the moment is Malcolm Schofield, who was my PhD advisor. So of course I'd say that, but there's a beautiful collection of his essays called How Plato Writes, which gives you some really good clues as to good ways of reading the dialogues, and some acute philosophical insights. We touched on commentary on Plato and tyranny. I think a really interesting political commentator is Danielle Allen at Harvard. Her paper on Donald Trump is the walking, talking example of a tyrannical soul, which was an online op-ed in the Washington Post long enough ago that it seems hard to imagine that they might publish something of that sort now, but she continues to write for them. She continues to be a very acute observer of modern politics, informed by her knowledge of ancient political thought as well as modern thought. So yeah, she, I think, is somebody to pay attention to. That's a roundup. I'm on Blue Sky if you're interested in my thoughts on culture and art. I'm on Instagram, and so yeah, those are places to watch out for. Another thing I'd point people to is a new open access journal from Cambridge called Public Humanities, which features the work of an amazing array of scholars who are thinking about how humanities scholarship can contribute to public life in the present moment. And that's all accessible online, free of charge to everybody. I wrote a piece on how ancient politics offers a good place for thinking through difficult questions that might be too partisan to address in a modern context for its initial manifesto essay. But there's loads of really impressive thought from an amazing bunch of scholars there. So I'd really encourage people to take a look at Public Humanities.
That's great. As a non-academic who talks to a lot of academics, I'm a big proponent of open access journals for obvious enough reasons. All right. Let's pause there then. Carol, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for having me.